wanted to bring an innovative, inspiring thinker to this summer's delegate assembly. Several names were mentioned, and in the end, I hope you will agree, we found the right person. In 2008, Time magazine named him one of the 10 best presidential cabinet members of the 20th century. He has run for governorship of Massachusetts and is now the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He is the chairman of Common Cause and is leading the group in its efforts of passing a constitutional amendment seeking to permanently overturn the controversial Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. He is an informal advisor to the Obama administration and is largely credited with reframing the president's message around jobs and the economy. He is a highly sought-after speaker and shows up in the rain at Occupy rallies. President Clinton wrote that our guest was one of the smartest and wittiest people he ever met. And, just a couple of weeks ago, Fox commentator Bill O'Reilly called him a communist. For the record, he is not a communist. He is a Rhodes Scholar, a Yale Law School graduate, and an acclaimed writer who served as Secretary of Labor for President Clinton. He has some big ideas on what is wrong with the economy, what President Obama should do to fix it, and what labor could do to turn the tides in favor of working-class people. He is Robert Reich. Well, Professor Reich, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thank you for inviting me.
I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the labor movement and what your general impressions of where the movement is right now and where it's going in the near future.
Organized labor is the most important social force for progressive change in this country. Unfortunately, the ranks of organized labor are way, way lower than they were in the 1950s, when about a third of the entire American workforce belong to a union. Now in the private sector, fewer than 8%, by some measures 7% of total employees belong to unions. In the public sector it's much better, but still not enough in terms of giving the American worker the kind of voice and bargaining leverage that average workers need. So I'm encouraged that organized labor is focusing on organizing. I'm encouraged that organized labor is fired up. But we, all of us, in the movement and those of us who are on the sidelines have got to do much, much more.
And what do you attribute to as the greatest factor in the decline of unionism? You mentioned in the 50s it was much higher than it is now. What really changed? Was it Reagan and the Patco thing, or was it a more systemic erosion of either the labor movement's push, rights that it was granted to it through the legislature and courts?
No, actually it was two related things. Number one, globalization, technological change, all of that gave consumers a lot of choices, and consumers wanted the low-cost product at Walmart that was made abroad or made in a non-union shop very often, and that hurt because remember, consumers are also workers. Workers are consumers, so they, by choosing that inexpensive product made abroad or made in a non-union shop, they were shooting themselves indirectly in their feet. But secondly, a lot of employers, beginning with Ronald Reagan, under pressure from Wall Street and under pressure from consumers looking for better deals, they fought unions. And beginning in 1981 with the Patco firing, a lot of employers said, well, now it's just, I can do anything I want in terms of fighting unions. Even if it may be illegal, I'll be fined. The worst that can happen is I've got to pay back pay to workers I fire illegally for trying to form unions. And that attitude, that very, very aggressive anti-union attitude, unfortunately, is still too much the case.
And you know, one of the issues that a lot of our members bring up with regards to troubles that unions had was NAFTA, and you know, it's greatly linked to the Clinton administration. Has it played out the way you thought it would in terms of the effects on labor and the workforce here in the United States? And on top of that, has Mexico benefited and Canada as the other partners to that agreement?
Well, a lot of people who were pro-NAFTA, like my boss, Bill Clinton, I think they exaggerated its benefits. A lot of people who were anti-NAFTA, like an awful lot of organized labor that I talked to, they also, I think, exaggerated its downside. I mean, a lot of the manufacturing facilities that went down to Mexico promptly went to China or Vietnam or some other place in Asia. The one thing that we can be certain about in terms of NAFTA's result is that it helped with the Mexican peso crisis. It would have been much worse if Mexico had not been part of the North American Free Trade group. I think that the labor and environmental side agreements on NAFTA needed to be stronger. I advocated for much stronger side agreements on labor and the environment, hopefully future trade agreements will have much stronger labor and environmental side agreements.
And has the Obama administration pursued those? There's been some trade agreement talks, at least with some Asian countries and stuff. Do you think that the Obama administration has pushed hard enough in terms of those types of side agreements with regards to labor and environment?
I think they could be stronger. I mean, with regard to the South Korean trade agreement, the Colombia trade agreement, I worry about the Colombia trade agreement because there were very anti-labor practices in Colombia still. I'd be more comfortable if we had much stronger labor and environmental protections. I mean, we can't expect every developing country to have the same wage rate as the United States, exactly the same working conditions as a rich nation, but we can insist that every other country that's a developing nation have labor standards that rise when and as the country becomes wealthier. So that, for example, a minimum wage is half the median wage.
Looking at the labor market now, or kind of the jobs that are out there, it seems that a lot of private sector unions are in the services portion of the economy and job market. What challenges or obstacles do you think labor could overcome in building up its private sector unionization workforce in the modern kind of economy, where you have Google and big employers or tech companies that aren't historically the workers there certainly don't view themselves as blue-collar kind of working-class folks?
Well, the easiest ones to pick off in terms of the service economy in the United States right now are the sectors where you have a lot of low-wage workers who are not unionized, who need unions, where there's no foreign competition directly, because this is personal service work, and when machines can't substitute for people because it's personal, it's attention. I mean, for example, look at retail. I mean, big retail chains like Walmart's and other big retail chains, or big restaurant chains, or big hospitals, or big hotel chains. All of these sectors should be organized. There's no excuse for them not being organized. The construction workers are fairly well organized, could be better organized. As the United States economy becomes more and more of a service economy, it is incumbent on our unions, all of them, to focus on organizing service workers. High-tech companies are going to be a harder nut to crack because many of their employees are highly educated specialists who don't really know about unions, don't think about unions, don't understand the role of unions, but they have got to be persuaded too.
And do you worry about the fate of labor moving forward with people, kind of the younger generations? They hold a lot of jobs. They're very transient in terms of where they work. It seems like they jump around a lot. Does that pose a big problem to labor moving forward?
Well, it poses a challenge because the more mobile the labor force, I mean, the less stable the job structure, the harder it is to organize people because they're here one day and then the next month they aren't. That's why we've got to think about organizing sectors again. I mean, the way organized labor worked in the 1950s and 60s was you organized the entire auto sector or the entire steel sector, the entire chemical sector. It was relatively easy in those days because there were 3 or 4 major players in each industry. There were oligopolies, the technical term for it. But what we've got to think about is organizing all of the hotel workers, all of the service sector workers in hospitals, all of the workers who are maintenance workers, all of the workers who are doing similar kinds of work. And we know that they're going to continue to do that kind of work, maybe for different employers. They're going to go moving from employer to employer. But think about sectoral unionizing rather than just employer and shop-based unionizing.
And based on your conversations with people that you know back in Washington, D.C., do you believe that EFCA has a chance of being passed? Do you know what status it has currently?
I think the Obama administration should have enacted the Employee Free Choice Act right away. It would have been good for workers. It would have been good politically. It would have been helpful by the 2012 election because there would be more unionized workers to basically be the ground troops. I think it's the first thing that the Obama administration ought to turn to, assuming that there's a second Obama administration. It's a good bill. It's an important bill. We need to guarantee that employees can exercise their rights under the National Labor Relations Act for organizing unions.
If we can change gears a little bit and talk about the economy, what is the one, if you could make one change to U.S. Economic policy currently, what would it be?
Actually, there's no magic bullet. I would do several things at the same time. I would, number one, expand the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a wage subsidy. I would pass the Employee Free Choice Act. I would raise taxes on the very rich so that you have a way of paying for education and infrastructure investments that we have got to do. I would make sure that we're not unfairly subsidizing employers who want to move abroad, and I would make it reasonably difficult for employers to outsource abroad. Not violating international treaties, but we've got to build good jobs in the United States.
Do you think Obama could have or should have done more in his first 2 years when the Democrats controlled Congress in terms of economic policy? And did you give him advice at that time, or his administration, or what would you have told him to do?
I would have told him to do more and more vigorously what he tried to do. That is, we needed a stimulus package that was actually larger than he got. Maybe he should have been tougher. Easy to say. I mean, he assumed that some Republicans would be reasonable. Same thing with health care. I would have pushed harder for a single payer or at least a public option. But again, easy to say. I was not in the trenches. He did the best he could. In terms of Wall Street, I would not have given a bailout without tying a string to that bailout, saying the big banks, look, you can't get bailed out unless you help people with mortgages who are underwater now because the big financial bubble you created burst. But that TARP, that bailout, was given without strings attached. Again, Obama, Democrats controlled Congress but didn't really control Congress because you needed 60 votes to stop Republicans in the Senate. And unfortunately, some of the House Democrats were really Republicans in disguise, blue dog Democrats that would not go along with what Obama wanted. So in a second term, assuming that there is a second term, we've got to make sure that there are Democrats who are controlling both houses and also Democrats who are willing to support the president.
You mentioned the stimulus package. Some of our members had emailed me asking you to talk a little bit about the stimulus package and whether you thought it was large enough. It seemed to a lot of people that work in local government that a lot of the dollars were used to plug holes and not actually add to new projects that were going on. They were simply making up for the loss of revenue that local and state governments were experiencing. Was that the purpose of it, or was it kind of misdirected in that sense?
It wasn't misdirected. I mean, look, if local and state governments would otherwise have cut back, then that stimulus money was well spent. I mean, the whole point is that government needs to, when you have a lot of people unemployed, when the private sector is not going to expand jobs, when individual consumers are scared to death and are insecure and they are not going to spend more, the federal government and the state and the local government has got to step into the breach and deal with that shortfall and spend more until the economy begins to grow again and people start getting jobs. And then when the economy is back on track, then you worry about budget deficits. I think that the stimulus should have been, instead of less than $800 billion, it should have been probably about $1.6 trillion, approximately double what it actually was.
And moving on that point, a couple months ago I heard Simpson Bowles give a lecture here in Oakland down at the Fox Theater. They were doing their lecture circuit, and they were saying some pretty scary stuff about, you know, where the economy is going and where the United States financially is going. Could Obama and his second administration, you know, if he's reelected, would it endanger the economy or the financial status of the country to enact a very large stimulus like that? And I mean, Simpson Bulls, I think, would say we can't afford to do that, and fiscal conservatives would say we can't afford to do it.
I have great respect for both of them, but I think that they overstate the problem. It's not the debt per se, the federal debt, that's the problem. It's the ratio of the debt to the economy as a whole. If the economy doesn't grow fast enough, that ratio gets worse and worse. Not because we're adding additional spending, but because we don't have growth. I mean, after the Second World War, the debt of the United States was 120% of the total economy. But we got out of that because the economy grew very, very fast, not because we spent less. In fact, the Cold War and national highway building and rebuilding Japan, rebuilding Europe, we spent even, well, not as much as we spent in World War II, but we spent it a lot. No, the ratio of debt to total economy shrank because the total economy grew so fast. And that's what Simpson Bowles are not acknowledging. Growth has to come first. Jobs have to come first. We've got to get the economy going. The Europeans are understanding this to their peril. I mean, the reason Europe is going into recession is because they forgot the denominator of that equation. They went into austerity economics, just whacking away at public budgets without understanding that that was going to shrink the economy and make the deficit situation, the debt situation in Europe even worse.
From there, with the recent election of Hollande in France and the conservatives losing in Greece, do you see Europe maybe turning their attention away from austerity and towards some other mechanisms for growth? And if so, how quickly would that affect the global economy and the United States economy?
Well, I hope the Hollande in France and also the new government in Greece, and there will be presumably a new government in Holland, and the government in Great Britain is not, Cameron is not all that popular. Hopefully these new governments are going to stand up to Angela Merkel in Germany and say, we cannot move toward austerity first. We want to be responsible in terms of the long-term budget deficits, but we've got to grow the economies of Europe and we've got to get jobs back first. But it's going to be a negotiated settlement right now between France and Germany.
And so, talking about politics, bringing it back to the United States, what do you foresee as being the large issues that President Obama and the presumptive nominee Mitt Romney for Republicans really clash over, and where do you think the American people will come down on those issues?
Well, the biggest issue is obviously what's the best way of getting back jobs and getting growth and getting wages back to what they were. The Republicans all still believe in trickle-down supply-side economics. That if you give tax breaks to corporations and to wealthy people, somehow that's going to help everybody else. We know that doesn't work. I mean, we know that the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 did not trickle down. We had fewer jobs and lower wages after the Bush tax cuts than we had before. Bill Clinton in the 1990s raised taxes, particularly on the rich, and also invested in education, invested in job skills, invested in infrastructure, and we created 22 million net new jobs, and the economy took off. Wages went up. So the Republican view of trickle-down supply-side economics is wrong. The opposing view, which I think is right, is the Democratic view, and that is, you might call it percolate-up economics. Get more jobs, more growth, better wages, give people, average workers, better bargaining leverage to get more wages. Then they can buy. They have more money in their pockets. They turn around, they buy, they create more jobs. That has a virtual effect on the economy, a virtuous effect on the economy in terms of making the economy stronger. You can only build economies from the bottom up. You can't build them from the top down.
And I know that you're the chairman of Common Cause, and one of the big issues that you guys are working on is Citizens United. How do you see that really playing out? In the media, it seems that it's portrayed often that, well, now corporations and unions can donate, money, unlimited amounts of money. Is that a fair assessment of the buying power, so to speak, in terms of the contributions that corporations and labor are able to make in the political process?
No, because corporations are really, for every dollar that corporations are providing into the political process after Citizens United, labor is providing about 6 cents. they're not comparable. It's all big corporations, and it's corporations often hiding behind the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because they can funnel their contributions there. They don't even have to report them. That nobody even knows what corporations are providing what donations. The Chamber of Commerce, their coffers are growing. You know, their minimal contributions, they've got contributions coming in millions of dollars from individual corporations, and nobody knows what corporations or what set of executives are providing that money. Even shareholders of those companies have no idea. You know, at the very least, it seems to me the Securities and Exchange Commission ought to make sure that there is full reporting by companies of exactly where they put the money, and not to front groups like the Chamber, but what the Chamber does with all of that money in terms of what candidates it supports, and also what causes through issue advertising it supports. I mean, there's no reason that union pension funds, for example, should be investing in ways that actually help big corporations that are turning that pension money around and putting it into the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to fight unions.
Over the last couple of years, we've seen the rise, both on the right and left, of large kind of grassroots movements, or at least they're portrayed as grassroots movements. And I'm talking about the Tea Party on the conservative side, and maybe the Occupy movement recently on the liberal or democratic side. How influential do you see those groups moving forward in terms of the base and translating that into electoral success?
Well, unfortunately, the Tea Party movement has been pretty successful in intimidating a lot of Republicans into thinking that if they don't move to the right, they're going to lose their jobs. They did it in Utah with Johnson. They did it recently in Indiana with Dick Lugar. They've done it around the country in House races. You don't need to do it that often. And you establish a credibility that makes every Republican move to the right. And that's exactly what's happened. The Occupy movement has certainly focused the public's attention on inequality, on the concentration of income and wealth, and political power at the very top. That was very important. But the next stage for the Occupy movement and for unions and for every other progressive force and voice in this country is to get it more involved in electoral politics and make sure that this drift to the right is reversed.
And just back to the Tea Party for a minute, do you think that was a more reactionary movement to Obama being elected and the policies that he was trying to implement, or was it more of a schism within the Republican Party itself, with some of the activists thinking that the party itself had moved too much to the middle or wasn't to the right enough?
There are a lot of different pieces to the Tea Party and a lot of different players. Number one, you've got many people that were outraged, as were people on the left, by the bailout of Wall Street. That started it all. I mean, that's where a lot of the energy came from. But instead of being outraged at Wall Street, they were outraged at the government that provided the bailout. But secondly, you had, and still have, a lot of evangelicals, right-wing Republicans who think that the most important things are what happens in people's bedrooms as opposed to what happens in the nation's boardrooms. And they are still very active. Thirdly, you had these front groups like Dick Armey's Crossroads, or Karl Rove's group, or the Koch brothers, and funneling money down to the Tea Party through various sub-front groups and helping organize the Tea Party and organize it in very, very directed political ways, focusing energies on those races where the Tea Party's influence was going to be magnified. So what's the Tea Party today? Again, it's a convolution of a lot of these separate groups, but the bottom line is that there's still some energy in the Tea Party that I believe could be harnessed by progressives with regard to wealth and power in this country, not being in the interest of average working people, but actually being in the interest of the wealth and the powerful.
And that reminds me of the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, and this kind of logic about why people on the right vote against their own economic interests sometimes. But what do you think Obama can do to really drive home that point? And do you think it's a point worth him really pursuing in this election?
It is very important to pursue it, and it's not just Obama, but all of us who have any kind of public access or public role, and a lot of people who don't, but ought to be energized and talking to their friends. I mean, unfortunately, many middle class, lower middle class, blue collar workers, even some unionized workers, believe a bunch of lies. I mean, one lie is, we've talked about, that's trickle-down economics. You give tax breaks to corporations and the rich, and everybody else gets better off. Another lie is that somehow most Americans are not paying enough taxes. Well, that's crazy. In fact, people are paying more if you look at the total tax bite in Social Security taxes, payroll taxes, local property taxes, sales taxes, user fees, than they've ever paid before, and they can't afford that. That's why we have to raise taxes on the rich. Another mythology is that government is always inefficient and the private sector is always efficient. Well, that's just not the case. I mean, look at BP and the oil spill. Look at what Wall Street did in terms of making a mess of the entire economy. Look at the private insurance companies in terms of how inefficient they are at delivering healthcare and creating a healthcare system that is the worst in the world in terms of dollar efficiency. I mean, the private sector has a terrible record. The public sector, on the other hand, if you look at Medicare and Social Security and a lot of things that we have come to take for granted, is the most efficient way of doing a lot of things. So that mythology also is stated over and over and over again about government being inefficient. We've got to educate the average worker about that being a big lie that is being perpetrated by the right.
And that seems to, and this may be the case or not, but your new book, Beyond Outrage, is that the central thesis of the book?
Central thesis of the book is we've got to get beyond outrage. I mean, a lot of people are angry. They're frustrated, they're cynical. They look at politics and they say, I don't want to get involved. They look at the whole system and they say it's rotten and I'm just going to take care of myself and my family and try to get through it. But we've got to get beyond that kind of outrage, because that kind of outrage and cynicism don't lead anywhere. We've got to organize, we've got to mobilize, we've got to energize. The union movement has got to take advantage of the fact that a lot of people are very angry at this anti-union, particularly in the States, in Ohio and in Wisconsin and Michigan, and in Indiana. You've got Republicans that are trying to destroy American labor unions. We've got to take advantage of the backlash against those governors and use it to build the union movement back up to what it was.
And do you see Obama and his team focusing on that enough in their build up to the race in November?
Well, Obama has said some very, very good and important things about what's happened to the average worker in this economy relative to the privilege and power at the top. The level of inequality being the worst level of inequality we've seen in this country in 80 years. And the wealthy paying the lowest taxes they've paid in 50 years. But I think Obama can be, and hopefully will be, even more aggressive in terms of talking about the necessity of people mobilizing and organizing, and the importance of trade unions, and the importance of getting back our economy and reclaiming our democracy.
And lastly, Professor, what can just the local union members that Local 21 represents, how best can they get involved and really work to get beyond their outrage and get more involved?
Well, a number of things. Number one, get out the vote. They're already doing it. They ought to dive into it. Number two, talk to their friends, their families, people who are in other states, red states, people who may disagree with them, but will at least listen to them. That also entails and necessitates getting the truth, getting the facts, reading my book, for example. But becoming a force that helps mobilize and organize and energize far beyond the local.
Well, on behalf of the entire Delegate Assembly and Local 21, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.